All right, so much art history and never enough time to cover it all. So let's go run through the art museum.
All right, our next artist is Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence was an important artist of the Harlem Renaissance. He did lots of artworks, but I want to focus on the Migration series that he painted. And this was a series of 60 paintings that he painted from 1940 to 1941. And if you look at this photograph, you can get a sense of the size of these artworks. They're quite small. If you want to go and visit these paintings, they're in two different locations. MoMA in New York City, that's the Museum of Modern Art, has all the even numbers. And Washington, D.C., at the Phillips Museum, they have all the odd numbers. I'm going to go over just a few and read the titles to you. This one says, in every town, blacks were leaving by the hundreds to go north and enter into the northern industry. So these paintings are documenting the most historical events of African Americans, their migration from the agricultural south to the industrial north. And three of the main cities that they traveled to was Chicago, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. This one says they were very poor. And one of the reasons why they were escaping the South was the extreme racism and Jim Crow laws down there. Another cause was lynching. Another of the social causes of the migrants leaving was that at times they did not feel safe, or it was not the best thing to be found on the streets late at night. They were arrested on the slightest provocation, and the migration spread. You can see the people here getting onto trains. The railroad stations in the south were crowded with people leaving for the north. The migrants arrived in great numbers. Also, notice how flat these images are as compared to Motley in that painting of the dancers, how everybody in that painting had all of, the different variations of skin tone. Whereas Jacob Lawrence, everybody has the same skin tone. They arrived at Pittsburgh, one of the great industrial centers of the North, in large numbers. And this one right here is one of the more famous ones from this whole migration series. So it shows a restaurant and it shows people in the restaurant. This is a restaurant up north where they had segregation. So there's this line down the middle of the restaurant in which divides people racially. On the left are the white customers, and on the right are the black restaurant customers. And the gold barrier guides our eye to each point of interest. Now, there's a total lack of linear perspective in this. Look at how this is much like a Cezanne painting, how we have different points of view going on at the same time. We're looking down at the tables, but we're looking straight at the people. And we're looking down at the floor, but we're looking straight at the poles that are in the middle of the floor. So we have this multiple viewpoints of, eye level viewpoint and then a bird's eye level viewpoint. They also found a different discrimination in the North, although it was much different from which they had known in the South. So the Northern discrimination was a lot more subtle and less overt. They're running away from lynchings in the South. So I guess, segregation in the North felt like an improvement. Still not right, though. There's a figure in the lower right, and we have an economy of elements. So, like the very simple shapes and colors, but we can tell this is a woman, an older woman with hunched shoulders. This one says race riots were very numerous all over the North because the antagonism that was caused between the black and the white workers. Many of these riots occurred because the black workers were used as a strike breaker in many of the northern industries. The blacks who had been in the North for quite some time met their fellow men with disgust and aloofness. The female worker was also one of the last people to leave the South. And in the North, the blacks had better educational facilities. Okay, we're going to start with this lady right here. This is Augusta Savage. All right, so her birthday, I don't usually talk about birthdays, but she was born on February 29th, 1892. What's unusual about that birthday? It is a leap year, yes. Here's a quote from her. She says, "I was a leap year baby, and it seems to me that I have been leaping ever since." I like that positive attitude. All right. So she grew up in Green Cove Springs. This is a brick making town in Florida. And the clay in the town was used for making bricks. And Savage would play in the red clay pits as a child. But before long, she stopped making mud pies and started making things, she says. But her father, a fundamentalist minister, disapproved of her making things. Okay, so like I was saying, her father was a fundamentalist minister and he disapproved of her making art. So he viewed his daughter's little clay figures as graven images and punished her for them. Does that sound familiar to you guys? Where we take an extreme version of religion that doesn't like people making art. You guys remember that term? That's right. Iconoclasm. All right, so he's using iconoclasm in her family. Savage, or she later recalled her father beating her several times a week. She says, quote, "He nearly whipped all the art out of me," unquote. When she grew up, she moved to Harlem and she attended art school there. She was super talented. She finished 2 years of the course requirements in just a few months. She was awarded a scholarship to the art school in Paris, but the scholarship rescinded her because she was black and it was thought that her presence would disturb the white students there. Isn't that disgusting? So, what she did is she opened a tuition free art school for black students. So, that was good, right? So, let's take a look at some of her art. What medium do you think this sculpture is? Yes, it looks like bronze, does it not? Bronze is super expensive, and she did not have much money to make her sculptures in bronze. So what she did is she makes them in plaster and then paints them to look like bronze. But the problem with that is plaster is very, very fragile, and most of her artwork that's made out of bronze does not survive. One of her most famous artworks is the harp. It was made out of bronze, and it was about 16 feet tall, but she could not afford to store the sculpture, so it was destroyed. What you're looking at on the right is a copy of the original sculpture. And here's a small version of it. One of the things I like about teaching modern art is that we can actually watch the people work on their craft. So I've got this short little video of Augusta sculpting. If you notice, there's a wire armature under this sculpture, so that tells me that she's working with like an oil-based clay on this. So it's likely she's going to make a mold and then would pour plaster in it, or if she had more money, would pour bronze into it. This sculpture is a portrait, and whoever filmed this is overlaying the model with the actual sculpture. So it's going to look odd for a second or two. I'm going to move on. Our next artist is William Henry Johnson. Some of the artists that I'm going to show you today, I just don't have much information on. It was difficult to find information on these artists. But what I want to point out is that notice the strong black outline around his shapes. And you notice also how flat his shapes are. And we'll notice that even more in the next artwork. In fact, look at how he has completely flattened the figures here. It almost looks like they are paper cutouts or they are squished between two pieces of glass under a microscope. Look at how squarish the shoulders are. And then look at her. Her face is in profile, but her body is frontal. That's just like how the Egyptians did, and then her feet are in profile again. I don't know if he was looking at the Egyptians or that was just how he worked. I just want to emphasize the flatness of his artwork. And it says here that he was inspired by memory and imagination. The subject was the southern rural life. Our next artist is Lois Malou Jones. And she came from a very comfortable Boston background. She lived in a good neighborhood growing up. In 1927, she was the first graduate of Boston School of Museum of Fine Arts. She was very talented, and she had multiple art school scholarships to go to Boston School of Museum of Fine Arts. She grew up in a good neighborhood, like I said, but there was not and there was not much racism in her neighborhood. But that was challenged when she lived in New York and Washington. It was a time when African American artists were banned from certain artistic opportunities. So check this out. When the Corcoran Gallery gave her an award in 1941, she sent a white friend to claim it rather than risking having it rescinded. And also, she would ask her white friends to submit her own artwork for her to art competitions. That's how she had to deal with racism at that time. At the beginning of her career, she worked with pattern design. And then what I want to point out here is that these patterns are still quite fresh today. If you look at those, that could be something that you would see like on a beach towel or in a like on a Hawaiian shirt or something. It's not like you're looking at a pattern that looks so 1930s. You know, it still looks fresh today, which I think is quite impressive. But she wasn't making much money from pattern design, and she realized that to make any kind of serious money, she would need to paint pictures. So here's one of her paintings in where she overlaps different African masks. She spent many summers in France where she enjoyed artistic and intellectual freedom, but and she was attending a school in Paris, and the teacher there asked her, quote, "Why do you use African themes in your paintings?" unquote. And Jones responded, quote, "If masters like Matisse and Picasso can use them, don't you think I should?" Unquote. Jones also taught at Howard University for many years, and she encouraged her students to travel to Africa to understand its art. Here's a painting she did of fabric vendors, and here's another painting she did. All right, let me introduce you to Richmond Bartha. Bart. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. He's a sculptor. And I don't have much information about this guy. He does these figures, and he does a lot of nude male figures. And we can watch him work for a few minutes. And you can see that he's working on a much larger scale than she was. You can see the armature underneath that helps support the clay as he adds more and more clay to the sculpture, and that keeps it from falling over. All right, here's a couple more of his figures: the reclining male nude and a boxer. And when you do any kind of search of Richmond Barthe or Barta or Bartha, this figure almost always comes up. And what I like about this figure is like, look at the interesting lines in this one and the interesting pose. It looks like an extreme contrapposto. And this sculpture is here in Houston, right? I'm terrible at selfies. All right, let's move on to Medavo Warwick Fuller. A devastating fire ruined much of her artwork, and she struggled to overcome the loss, and she nearly abandoned creating art altogether after the fire. But what she did in her artwork, she combined art with activism. So in this sculpture right here, we have three figures. These two figures that you see in the photographs is a young male and a young female, partially clothed, and they're standing under a tree. What kind of reference do you think that could be? In fact, the tree is called the tree of knowledge. Yeah, we're talking about like Adam and Eve. Yeah. And then around the corner is another figure, and this the figure on the far left. She is the allegory for humanity, and she rests her right hand on the young man's shoulder. And in later sculptures, the artist focused on the state of the world, particularly what was happening for women and African Americans. All right, I've got a little story to tell you. Actually, it's history. I should put a history up there. But in 1918, a black man was lynched, and his wife, Mary Turner, denounced the murder. That means she was very vocal about it, and she spoke out about it. And in response, a mob of hundreds captured her and hung her upside down from a tree. And she died from that lynching. So she was lynched 12, but she was pregnant at the time, which also killed the baby. Fuller creates this sculpture right here to commemorate Mary Turner. And so she's depicted as cradling an infant in her arms, and she's leaning away from the grasping hands and the flames at the base of the sculpture. This sculpture is one of the first sculptures created by an African American, specifically depicting the brutality of lynch mobs. Our next artist is Elizabeth Catlett. The subjects of her artwork are Black identity, Black history, labor, civil rights, and her political subjects are based on her experiences as a Black woman, family memories. If you Google her, this is the image that pops up quite a bit. And then in this one, notice that she's right next to a fence with barbed wire. And the title of this is My Reward Has Been Bars Between Me and the Rest of the Land. So that means that she is unable to access land to build a career on or to grow things to feed herself. Here's a lynching image. And then here's a sculpture that she created of mother and child. Can you tell what it's carved out of? Yeah, wood. It's a beautiful sculpture, beautiful shapes. Our next artist is Charles White. In this painting, the contribution of African Americans to democracy in America. I wish I had more information on this, but we're going to look a little bit more closely at his next painting. I've got a little bit of history for you. So we're going to go to Georgia and Schley County in Georgia, and we're going to look at Rosalie Ingram and John Ed Stratford. So this is Rosalie over here, and then she's a widow. So her husband is dead, and she and John are both sharecroppers on a third person's property. She doesn't own the property. He doesn't own the property, but they're both farming on it to raise money. And then the landowner will take some of that money. So she farmed adjoining lots with white sharecropper Ed John Stratford. On November 4th, 1947, Stratford confronted Rosalie, accusing her of allowing her livestock to roam freely on his land. Rosalie reminded Stratford that both the livestock and the land were owned by their landlord. Stratford struck her with a gun, and several of Rosalie's sons came to her defense and beat John Ed Stratford to death. So he died, and then Rosalie and her four sons were arrested. Long story short, they had a very unfair trial and they were sentenced to death. This trial was on all the papers, and the world reacted to their unfair trial. There were lots of protests. And then the death sentence was changed to life sentences. There were still protests, and eventually they were all released in 1959. So Charles White commemorates that event with this image right here of Rosalie and her two sons. And this was drawn in ballpoint ink. And I really like Charles White's imagery on like this one and this one right here. Our last artist of today is Hale Woodruff. And I've got some more history to throw at you. The name of this boat is La Amistad. Have you ever heard of Amistad before? Right. They made a movie of it in the early 2000s. Anyways, this is a Spanish ship, and in June 28th, 1839, 53 African slaves were on board that ship, 49 adults and 3 children, which were girls. These people were kidnapped and sold into slavery. And in 1839, that was illegal. So America and Britain had made the transatlantic slave trade illegal at that time. Slavery in the countries was legal, but kidnapping people from Africa and carrying them across the Atlantic, that was illegal. On this ship, there was not enough space for the ship to store all the captives below deck. So half the captives were stored on the main hold or on the top deck, and the other half was beneath the deck. Down below, the captives had found a rusty file and sawed through the manacles. They quickly went up on deck, armed themselves with machete-like cane knives, and they attacked the crew. They gained control of the ship. They killed the captain and some of the crew, and they spared 2 of the owners of the slaves so that they could guide the ship back to Africa. Now, the ship, without the captain manning it, it didn't quite go back to Africa, and it kind of zigzagged back and forth up the Atlantic Ocean and eventually found its way to New York City. The captives were arrested for mutiny, and the penalty for mutiny is execution. The slave traders were arrested for enslaving free Africans. Since 1808, the United States and Britain had prohibited international slave trade. And this story was in the news at the time, so it was a wildly popular story. The captives of the Amistad were a popular cause for the abolitionists in the U.S., and it was a very public trial. The judges ruled in favor of the Africans. In 1841, the court ruled that the captives had been illegally transported and held as slaves, and that they rebelled in self-defense, and it ordered them freed. And 35 survivors returned to Africa in 1842. Okay, so there's 3 paintings that I want to show you from this story by Hale Woodruff. The first painting is the actual takeover. And I want you to look at how bright the colors are. And then look at how like crowded that space is. And then look at the chiaroscuro of the figures and how they look very well rounded. And also, with the fabrics and the sails as well. The second painting tells of the trial. So you can see the slaves of the Amistad on the left, and we have the judge in the center. And then the third painting shows them returning to Africa. Okay, does anybody have any questions for the Harlem Renaissance or for this class? All right. That'll finish us for today.